We've been in a sermon series entitled EMBARK, and EMBARK means that we embark on a journey, that we begin the journey of our life and the next steps in our faith. And as we looked at those things, last week we talked about how do we leave the dock? How do we begin our journey? Today, we're going to talk about recruiting our crew. How do we get those people who are going to go with us and walk with us in our journeys? And what do we do? And today's scripture, of course, was about Jesus beginning to gather his crew together, the disciples that would come and walk with him for at least 3 years. And many of them he knew already before he even called them. They were people he already had relationships with. And when we think about the disciples, and we know that there are 12 disciples, here's a quick question for you. How many of you confidently could name all 12 disciples? Let me see your hands. Yeah, that's about what I thought. Okay, we got 1, 2, maybe, all right. And I don't know if y'all know, that's like a 1% maybe of the congregation, and that's being optimistic, that could do that. Okay, so we're going to work on that a little bit today. By the time you leave, I want you to at least be able to get a passing grade on naming the disciples. Many of you can name the Kardashians. Let's make sure we can name the disciples, okay? I mean, let's make sure we get these priorities out there to be able to do this. So we heard in our story today that we have two sets of brothers who get called out of the boats. They're fishermen. They're in Capernaum. We have Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, and we have James and John, who are sons of Zebedee. Later, they'll also be called sons of thunder. That's 4, okay? You're a third of the way there, if you've got those. Now, we're going to do some things with some associations, some word associations, name associations that might help you remember this beyond just hearing me say it today. All right, so we have Simon Peter. There's also another Simon. He is Simon the Zealot. How many of y'all know what a zealot is? Okay, this is a political activist in biblical times. He is very strong against Rome and anything that's associated with Rome. And before he meets Jesus, this is who he is, and this is what he's known as, Simon the Zealot. Now, directly opposite of Simon the Zealot is Matthew, the tax collector, who is also in Capernaum, who is also somebody who works for Rome. He's a tax collector. He's a part of what Simon is against. And Jesus pulls both of them into the disciple group, into the fellowship. How many of y'all think there might have been just a little bit of conflict, a little sparks flying between those two? All right, so we have 2 Simons. We also have 2 Jameses. We have James, brother of John. We hear a good bit about James, brother of John. We also have another James, and it's not Jesus' brother. He has the really unfortunate title throughout history to be known as James the Less. Now, how many of y'all would like that? I mean, how many of y'all would like to be known as Jeff the Less, or be known as, John the Less, or anything like that? I mean, but he's known as the Less because we know less about him than any other disciple in the Bible. We think we know who his dad was, and that's about it. We really don't hear from him any other time except for during his calling. All right, so now you're up to 7. All right, you got the 2 sets of brothers. You got 2 people who have the same names that are part of this. You've got Matthew, who you can easily relate to Simon the Zealot because you know there's conflict between them. You're already at 7. I mean, this is pretty good, right? I mean, you're doing pretty well. There are also another person that's another disciple that we can associate with the name James, has a father named James, and that's Thaddeus. Thaddeus has a father named James, and he's not Jesus' brother. He's not either of the other 2. He's another James, and Thaddeus also goes by the names. This is when it gets a little confusing for people. He also goes by the name Jude or Judas, but not Judas Iscariot. Well, you just went from 7 all the way to 9. Because now you remember Judas Iscariot. You've got that one on there. You've got Thaddeus, who is also known as Judas or Jude. He might have been the one who wrote the book Jude. We're not 100% sure on that. So far, you're already at 9 disciples. Congratulations. I mean, you're 2/3 of the way, or 3/4 of the way. 3/4 of the way. That's a 75. That's a passing grade. You're doing pretty well. Most of you probably doubted that you would know 9 disciples by the time you left today. And doubt is another trigger word for one more disciple to remember. That will put you at 10 with doubting Thomas. You're now at 10. You're doing really, really well. I have absolutely no good association for the last 2, though, except for that they're friends with each other. And that matters, because one of them is named Philip. Philip's from Bethsaida. Philip comes and he sees Jesus. He sees things that's going on, and he goes and he tells his friend Bartholomew. And there, in speaking to Bartholomew, he tells him about Jesus of Nazareth. And Bartholomew says the famous line, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And those are the 12. Now, it's important to know their names. It's important to know those kind of things. But it's more important to recognize the why behind some of this, to understand that Jesus pulls this group of 12 together. There are all sorts of theories about who they were and why they were brought in and why they were part of it. But when we stop and we look at it, the 12 that Jesus invites in, he doesn't just invite them in to be his friend, to be in fellowship with him. He also invites them in to be in fellowship with one another. Every invitation of Jesus is a both and. It's not just a relationship with Jesus, it's a relationship with all who follow him, with all of his children throughout the world. You have complicated relationships. I don't know if any of you have brothers, but sometimes brothers can be complicated relationships. One of them used to bossing the other one around, and sometimes that doesn't go so well. Then you also have helicopter moms who come in, like with James and John, who want to come in and hover over everything and say, "Hey, will you make sure you take care of my boys? When you come into your glory, will you make sure that they're at your right hand?" Relationships can be hard and complicated sometimes, but they're also the things that save us. I think about Matthew and Simon a lot. Anytime I'm hanging out with people that just aren't like me. I don't know about you. Some of you have learned some great truths about that. One of my favorite examples in all of literature about people who do not think alike, who do not agree, who are raised to not like each other, people who are like that, who come together and form solid relationships with each other. One of my favorite stories is Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was good friends with C.S. Lewis, and they talked a lot, and they spent time together a lot. And it's really interesting to look at some of the characters that developed out of J.R.R. Tolkien's. But in the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, they're gathering a group of people who will travel with Frodo to Mount Doom to get rid of the Ring of Power, to destroy it in there. How many of y'all would love to be on a trip to a place called Mount Doom? How many of y'all that sounds like, yeah, sign me up, would love to do that, unless it's at Disney and it sounds like it might be kind of, a fun horror show or something. They're on their way to Mount Doom. They're going together, and they bring together this group that has no relationship with one another except for the hobbits. They know each other. And they bring them together, and there are two characters in there that become two of my favorite characters. There's Gimli, the dwarf. Dwarf is short, stocky, strong, highly opinionated, never in doubt. And then there's Legolas, an elf. Dwarves and elves do not get along. They are as different as they can be. They look different. They're physically different in every way they can be. Theologically or focus in philosophy and life is very different from one another. And they antagonize one another, particularly Gimli towards the Legolas. They pick at one another. They compete with one another. They're always kind of at each other just a little bit as they're beginning this journey. But there becomes this moment, and it actually is all the way into the second book. There comes this moment when they are in the middle of a battle. And whether a battle is something you're struggling with in life or it's a real battle or not, those are often the places we form friendships we didn't expect. They're in the middle of the battle of Minas Tirith. And as they're preparing for this and they look out and there are overwhelming odds against them, Gimli says just out loud, not looking at Legolas because that would be too intimate. He says, "I never thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf." To which Legolas smiles and replies, "What about side by side with a friend?" And Gimli grins and says, "Aye, that I can do." And it's this wonderful, tender moment in the midst of some of the hardest things that life can go through. Some of you have already learned that lesson in life. You have a close friend or someone that you continue to be connected with in significant ways who's very different from you. Maybe everything they think or they believe just seems different or contrary to you. Or maybe they're just one of those people that their relationship just takes more work than most relationships for you. But you also know in the midst of a storm, in the times when life gets hardest, in the times when everything seems dark around you, you know that as soon as the storm starts to let up and you can see a little further, that they're standing there right by your side, and they have been all along, because what they are beyond all other things, bigger than all the differences in the world that the world has created around us, what they are most of all is loyal. And they will be there with us, standing beside us. When you're picking your crew to walk with you in life, and sometimes we just get picked by our crew, you want people and to pick people who will walk with you through the valleys of the shadow of death, not just celebrate with you on the mountaintops as things are coming. You want people who will be with you through every phase of your life, and that when you need them, you know that they will be there, and you will do the same with them. When you're picking your crew, you don't want to choose somebody who just wants to give you advice from a distance. We call those spectators. You want people who will put skin in the game and be there for you and walk with you through life. You want those people that you know that you can trust. And no matter what happens and no matter how much you might bicker with one another, no matter how much you may struggle with one another or things, you know that they will show up and be there for you. Jesus chose people that in the worst of their moments, in the worst of their lives, as different as they each were, they gathered in one room together, all except for Judas, of course. But they gathered in that one room together because where they needed to be was with each other as they had lost their leader. A second lesson we learn from Jesus and the disciples is that Jesus doesn't surround himself with people who don't question him. He doesn't surround himself around people who all think like him or will just agree with him on whatever he does. He has multiple disciples who will ask him question after question. He even has a disciple in Peter who tries to stop him from doing something. You want people around you who will speak up, who will ask the hard questions, who will say the things that need to be said, who will challenge you if they feel like you're going in the wrong direction, and yet will love you and walk with you no matter what you decide. You want those people on your crew who have the courage to speak up, and the loyalty to walk alongside of you. When I was a teenager, my mother used to ask me all sorts of questions, and it just irritated me to no end. I mean, I'd walk in the door, she'd start asking me questions. I'd be leaving the door, she was asking me questions. And then I got kids of my own, and I wondered why she didn't ask more questions. But questions are a way of trying to understand. They're ways of trying to be connected to people. Questions are a way of trying to fully be in with people. Questions are not accusations. When you're picking the crew, the people who will walk with you through life, the people who care enough about you to ask you the hard questions and sit through the hard conversations are the people you cherish deeply. They're the ones that are hard to ever replace. In Lord of the Rings, there's a time when Merry and Pippin, who are two hobbits along with Frodo and Sam, the four hobbits are together, and Merry and Pippin say this to Frodo, who is setting out on his own and has been out on his own. Merry and Pippin are two ne'er-do-wells. They're the friends that you have who always get in trouble, but somehow seem to skate out of it. Merry and Pippin say this to Frodo: you can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the better end, and you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We are your friends, Frodo. We are always your friends. That's true fellowship. That's true fellowship that we are invited to enter into with not only Jesus, but with one another, to enter into with our friends, to be at those places of loyalty, to walk beside one another, and to say, it's not okay for you to not let me know what's going on with you. Perhaps my favorite quote about friends we choose comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who simply wrote, "The only way to have a friend is to be one." When we look at the disciples that are called to Jesus, Jesus is first and foremost a friend to them. He is someone who loves them and cares for them and shows them what it means to be a friend and to be loyal to them throughout all of it. Even Judas, who he knows will betray him, is at the Last Supper by his left side, sitting close to him. There's a loyalty from Jesus that goes beyond how we behave, that goes beyond how we act, that goes so far beyond what most of us can be tolerant for, that Jesus still has Judas at the table with him. This is what it means to be in fellowship with Christ. To be so deeply loving and caring to someone that no matter what, we do not leave them. Jesus bonded in fellowship with his disciples in such a way that when he resurrected and they were gathered, scared to death in that upper room, he came to them anyway. He showed them that he was with them and would always be with them to the end of their days. And in loyalty and fellowship to him, they eventually left that upper room and spread the good news all throughout the world, learning and showing how to be in fellowship with one another in a way that the world had never known. They became the messengers of the love that they had received in fellowship with Christ and with each other and with all the world. And that's the good news. Thanks be to God.